The problem is that the Revolutionary War is told by the leaders, the wealthy man who could afford to go off and fight. George Washington owned a massive plantation that essentially ran itself while he was gone. Paul Revere was a wealthy merchant and silversmith. John Adams was a European diplomat and lawyer. Every person you think of from the Revolutionary War was a wealthy merchant, landowner, or politician. Most of them were diplomats and aristocrats in Europe, and simply moved their wealth or households to the New World. The problem with this is that everything we know is told from the perspective of these people instead of the commoners. The Revolutionary War is often told as a unified war of the common people, but by telling it from the perspective of the common citizen, it quickly becomes a much more fragmented and turbulent affair. This will allow us to better judge and assist current revolutions instead of comparing them to a false image of our revolution. Writings by men such as Thomas Paine helped convince the colonists to enlist in the army, but after an initial burst of enthusiasm, support for the war quickly faded. Some of the young men who came to create the Continental Army went in with an expectation of becoming heroes and gaining both independence and the spoils of war. Others joined as a result of the draft. The war was unable to deliver for either of these parties' romanticized notions, and instead resulted in the harsh realities of camp life. The soldiers were routinely underfed, and very few were ever actually paid for their service. Although there were laws concerning draft age, this did nothing to stop boys young as 11 from enlisting in the army simply to increase numbers. The men who couldn't afford to dodge the draft were the most at risk of economic loss during the war. The common men were abandoning their farms and businesses for months at a time to fight. The plantation owners who could afford to leave for long stretches of time rarely even did so. These factors created a high amount of tension in the army. This tension was the cause of a high occurrence of mutiny throughout the war. On New Year's Day, 1,700 soldiers seized artillery and marched to Philadelphia to protest their conditions, lack of pay, and being required to serve longer than they were initially promised. The Army's reputation of being unable to provide for its soldiers became well known, and voluntary enrollment plummeted, and those drafted were far less than enthusiastic. Very few accounts from the actual commoners remain. Almost all of our information comes from the leaders, not the average person. The problem with this is that the leaders often overlook the individual suffering and sacrifice that it took to achieve a goal, and details are often changed to fit a better theme. This cheapens the hardship that went into achieving the revolution and sometimes changes the tone entirely. Armies were under-equipped, often unpaid, and many weren't fed enough. Mutinies were incredibly common, and very few soldiers were happy or content in the army. On New Year's Day in 1781, close to 2,000 soldiers took control of artillery and marched towards Philadelphia, demanding to be fed and paid. They eventually dissolved, but more than half of the soldiers simply deserted and went home. Many soldiers were orphans or under the legal recruiting age. The government just needed soldiers and didn't really care where they came from. An example was David Hamilton Morris, who enlisted at the age of 11 and served in the army throughout the Revolutionary War. The civilians were just as fragmented as the soldiers. Different groups would impose different boycotts and restrictions, and then fight over which is right. They would go to wealthy merchants' homes and break things or destroy British imports. In protest of the Stamp Acts, angry mobs made effigies of the stamp officials and paraded them around town before setting them on fire in front of the official's home. Tarring and feathering people who didn't follow boycotts was also common, and in some of the more extreme cases, lynch mobs even executed offending citizens. A more willing workforce was women. While women had been previously ignored in politics and large-scale economies, the traditional preference for homemakers was reinforced with the ideal of the spinning bee. This movement encouraged women to go beyond their typical household chores and to also spin their own fabric. By doing this, women were replacing the fabric that would be otherwise imported from England. Along with creating fabric, women were expected to house and entertain patriot officers. This resulted in an enormous drain of resources for some women, particularly those in the lower and middle class. Wealthy women's lives went largely unchanged during the war. Their biggest sacrifice was that of luxury goods from England. However, some women did far more than take soldiers in. They followed them across the country. These women became known as camp followers. These women cooked and cleaned for the army and served as battlefield nurses, but they were greatly unappreciated. George Washington ordered that these women not be allowed to ride the wagons or have their personal belongings in the army as they marched. Even though Washington saw the camp followers as a hindrance, most modern historians agree that if there had been more nurses and washerwomen, disease would have spread far more slowly through the camps. In return for this, the women got nothing. Camp followers were not paid or even given food rations. Nurses were paid only 10% of what the male surgeons were. The only thing that they had the same as the soldiers was their exposure to deadly diseases and stray bullets. Women were suddenly expected to work much harder, as they had to manufacture almost all their own goods while the boycotts were going on. In order to convince them to do this, they had to be given more respect and attention than they had previously. Although they still technically weren't allowed to serve in the army, camps of women would follow behind the groups of soldiers, serving as cooks, nurses, and even soldiers when things got desperate. Despite all of this, very few were actually recognized or paid for their work, and none got what they truly deserved. Another big cause of division in the colonies was slaves. Britain decreed that any slave that made it to the British Army to enlist would be freed, and the colonists desperately didn't want that to happen. Some slaves were able to escape and fight for the British, but the colonists became even more controlling and abusive, and were able to almost completely stop slave escapes. Many still tried, as escape was the only means of freedom, but they were often caught and sent back or killed, nearly 100% of the time. Pictures like this don't do justice to the Revolutionary War, or the commoners who sacrificed so much to make it successful. To tell the story of the Revolutionary War without them is like talking about moon landings without telling the story of the Challenger flight. It cheapens the struggle that got us to where we are today. The Revolutionary War wasn't unified, it wasn't as clean and decisive as it is said to be, and it sure wasn't as easy as people say. But by understanding that, we can better understand and assist revolutionary movements in the present and future, whether they're in Egypt or Brazil or anywhere else in the world that sees a need to overthrow their government.